The first thing I noticed was the smell. Sandalwood, lotus oil, the thick, sweet rot of too many flowers in an enclosed space. The kind of smell that clings to fabric and hair and skin until you cannot tell where it ends and you begin. It was the smell of wealth performing itself, of people who had never gone hungry burning expensive things just to watch them smoke. The second thing I noticed was that I was lying down. I did not lie down, not voluntarily. In my line of work, lying down meant dying, and I had not died in 11 years of service, not once. Not even the night a blade had opened my side from hip to rib, and I had pressed my palm against the wound and walked 4 li through a pine forest before reaching safety. But I was lying down now, and I was alive. I opened my eyes. The ceiling above me was carved lacquered wood, painted with cranes and clouds, inlaid with gold leaf so fine it seemed to float. The bed curtains were crimson silk, drawn back with jade hooks. A bronze incense burner shaped like a coiled dragon breathed smoke into the air from the corner of the room, slow and indolent, the coils of it rising toward the carved ceiling as if it had nowhere in particular to be. I had been in many wealthy rooms. This was not a wealthy room. This was a room inside a palace. I sat up. The body was wrong. I knew that before I had finished moving, before I had even registered the white sleeping robe or the unbound hair or the smoothness of hands that had clearly never held a weapon. I had spent my entire adult life in absolute command of every muscle, every nerve, every fraction of motion in my body. That body had known how to fall without sound, how to breathe without being heard, how to disappear inside the space between one moment and the next. This body did not know any of those things. It was soft in places I was not soft, smaller, younger. The hands that lifted the silk bed curtain were slender and unmarked, the fingers uncalloused, the wrists so delicate I could have closed one hand around both of them. I looked at those hands for a long moment. Then I thought, I am dead. And then, more calmly than perhaps the situation warranted, I was not dead. Death did not have sandalwood ceilings. So the question was, whose body was I in and why? The answer came not from any dramatic revelation, but from something far more ordinary. A bronze mirror sitting on the dressing table across the room, reflecting back a face I had never worn. She was beautiful in the way that ancient paintings depicted beauties, the kind of face that made poets reach for inadequate metaphors about moons and flowers. Dark eyes under arched brows, lips the color of red lacquer, skin so pale it was nearly luminous. She was perhaps 17, 18 at most, the youth of her still present in the roundness of her jaw, the unguarded openness of her expression. She looked, I thought, like someone who had cried recently and often. She looked like someone who had given up on something. That was the face looking back at me when the door to the chamber opened without a knock, and a young woman in green attendance robes walked in carrying a breakfast tray, glanced at me sitting in bed, and stopped so abruptly that the teacup slid sideways and only did not fall because she grabbed it with both hands. "Your Highness," she said. Her voice was careful, controlled in the specific way of someone who was choosing each word before speaking it. "I appear so," I said. She set the tray down on the side table and came toward me, and I let her, watching the way her eyes moved across my face, searching for something, checking, I realized, whether I was in state to speak to or whether this was going to be one of the days that required a different kind of handling entirely. I had been an assassin for 11 years. I had memorized the faces of targets, of guards, of witnesses, of every person who passed through the periphery of a mission. Reading people was not a skill I had been taught. It was oxygen. It was the thing between me and a blade across the throat. This girl was afraid of the person she thought she was looking at, but it was a practiced fear, the kind that had been lived with long enough to become ordinary. She was not afraid of me specifically right now. She was afraid of what I might become. That told me a great deal. Her name, I learned, as she moved through the quiet efficiency of arranging the breakfast tray and settling a robe over my shoulders, was Xiao Hui. She had served in this chamber for 3 years. She had the kind of careful loyalty that came not from love, but from having nowhere else to go. She served the 4th princess of the Donghua dynasty. She served, which was to say, me, the 4th princess. I sat at the dressing table and let Xiao Hui brush out my hair with practiced strokes, and I let my eyes move slowly around the room, cataloging everything while my expression remained neutral. The room was large and well-appointed, but had the quality of a place that had been deliberately denied something. The painting on the wall was beautiful, but slightly too small for the space, as if a larger one had been removed. The window looked out not on the garden, but on the inner courtyard wall. The incense in the dragon burner was good quality, but not the best grade. Small slights, accumulated. A life lived just slightly below what it should have been. I thought about the face I had seen in the mirror, the one that had clearly cried often in this too-quiet room. "Xiao Hui," I said. "Yes, Your Highness? Tell me about the physician's visit yesterday." She paused, just a fraction of a second, just long enough for someone who was not looking for it to miss entirely. I was not someone who missed things. "The imperial physician came at the hour of the rooster, Your Highness, as he has each week. And his assessment?" Another pause, longer this time, her hands in my hair stilled, just slightly, then resumed their movement. "Your Highness," she said quietly, "you know." I wanted to hear it said aloud, I said. Say it plainly. She met my eyes in the mirror, and I saw, in that meeting, something shift in her, a small, barely perceptible recalibration, as if the person looking back at her in the reflection was not quite the person she had expected. "The imperial physician believes," she said carefully, "that Your Highness has no more than 1 year. 1 year." I held that sentence the way I had once held a throwing blade, flat across my palm, balanced, feeling its weight before committing to the throw. 1 year to live. The body I was in, the beautiful, soft body of this princess who had clearly been crying herself slowly to sleep in this too-quiet room, was dying. Whatever I had inherited, whatever bargain the universe had made in dropping me here, it had come with a countdown already running. Well, I had worked with tighter timelines. I said, "Thank you." My voice was even. Xiao Hui looked at me in the mirror again with that strange recalibration on her face, like she was looking at a painting and noticing for the first time that something in it had changed since yesterday. "Your Highness is calm," she said. It was not quite a question. "I find very little is improved by not being calm," I said. And then, "Sit down, not to serve. Sit." She sat, perching on the edge of the low seat near the window with the wary compliance of someone accustomed to unexpected instructions. I turned from the mirror to face her directly. "I want you to tell me everything," I said, "from the beginning. Who decided I should live in this room? Who visits? Who does not? Who the physician reports to after each visit? Who in this palace would notice if I stopped declining and started improving, and how they would feel about it?" "Do not soften anything. I am already dying. There is no news worse than that, and I would rather have useful information than comfortable silence." Xiao Hui stared at me. For a long moment she simply stared. And then, slowly, like someone who had been holding a breath for years, she began to talk. Her name had been Wei Ming Chu, the 4th princess of the Donghua dynasty, daughter of the late imperial noble consort Wei, who had died of a wasting illness when Ming Chu was 11. She had no powerful maternal clan behind her, no elder sisters with influence, no brothers who bothered to acknowledge her. She had what all the least important members of the imperial family had: a title, a stipend, a room in the correct wing, and an ocean of politeness that was indistinguishable from contempt. The illness had come 2 years ago. No one knew the cause. The imperial physicians had theories, constitutional weakness, grief for her mother, the dampness of her pavilion's location. Treatment had been administered. It had not helped. The decline was slow, steady, and expected. What was also expected, though Xiao Hui said this with the careful phrasing of someone who knew it was not safe to say directly, was that no one particularly minded. The fourth princess had no allies. She had no enemies worth naming because you did not bother having enemies who were already dying. She had, Xiao Hui told me in a voice kept deliberately even, one older half-brother who visited 3 times in 2 years, always briefly, always with the expression of someone fulfilling an obligation before it expired on its own. She had a half-sister, the second princess, who had not visited at all, but who sent seasonal gifts so expensive they constituted their own form of insult. I am generous to people I do not care about. She had, it appeared, spent the last 2 years becoming slowly accustomed to her own erasure. I listened to all of this without interrupting. And somewhere during Xiao Hui's careful, quietly heartbroken account of Wei Mingchu's life, I stopped thinking of the face in the mirror as someone else's face. I had been many people. That was the nature of my former profession. You became whoever the mission required, slipped in and out of identities the way most people changed robes. I had been merchants' daughters and riverboat singers and mid-level court officials, and once, memorably, a traveling physician's assistant. I had inhabited those lives completely for as long as I needed them and left without sentiment when the work was done. But there was a difference this time. Those people were costumes. Wei Mingchu was dead, and I was, apparently, all she had left. The thought settled into me with the specific weight of something real. I did not have a name for what I felt. I had never been particularly talented at naming feelings, finding them less useful than accurate information. But I know that I looked at the small, carefully maintained room, the too small painting, the window facing the wall, and I thought, someone let this happen to her. Someone let a 17-year-old girl fade quietly in a corner room until even she believed she deserved it. That someone was still here, still walking these corridors, still accepting seasonal gifts and making brief visits and congratulating themselves on their generosity toward a dying girl. I had 1 year. In my experience, 1 year was a very long time. The physician's name was Shen Bo Zhao. He was 53 years old, highly ranked, and had served the inner palace for 2 decades. He came every 7th day at the hour of the rooster, stayed for precisely as long as it took to take a pulse, ask a few questions, and write in the treatment record, and then left. He reported to the chief physician, who reported to the Empress Dowager's household, where the reports were filed and not particularly read. This was the official version. Xiao Hui, who had been in this room for 3 years and who had the eyes of someone who watched carefully because she had nothing else to do, had noticed something. She told me this slowly, in a low voice, choosing each word. She had noticed that on 3 occasions in the past year, the physician had arrived slightly after his usual time, that on each of those occasions, he had arrived from the eastern corridor, not the central passage where his offices were, and that on each of those occasions, Princess Mingchu had been slightly worse in the days following. I looked at her steadily as she said this. "You have never told anyone," I said. "Who would I tell?" she said. It was not a question. I was quiet for a moment. Then, "You are telling me now."
"Your Highness is different today," she said simply, and then she pressed her lips together, as if she had said more than she intended. I let it pass, but I filed it away. The fact that even Xiao Hui, who had known Ming Zhu for 3 years, could feel something different in the room today, something that had not been there yesterday. That was either an advantage or a vulnerability, and I intended to find out which before anyone else noticed. The question of the physician would have to be approached carefully. I had worked before in environments where I did not know the full picture, where I had to build my map of power from fragments, reading the space between what people said and what they meant, the things they reached for and the things they refused to touch. This was that kind of environment. more complex in some ways because I was inside it rather than observing from the periphery, more tractable in others because I had 1 year and I intended to use every hour of it. That afternoon, for the first time in what Xiaohui quietly said had been weeks, Wei Mingzhu's chamber received a request for a walk in the Western Garden. Xiaohui helped me dress with barely concealed bewilderment, producing a pale lavender outer robe trimmed with silver thread and the jade hairpin that had been Mingzhu's mother's. I let her dress me and stood still for it, feeling the unfamiliarity of the body around me, the lightness of it, the strange softness, the way it tired from simply standing that my actual body would have found almost comically easy. I needed to know the limits of what I was working with. You did not go into the field without knowing your equipment. That afternoon was beautiful. I noticed that with the slightly detached appreciation of someone cataloging assets. A pavilion near the lotus pond that offered sightlines in 3 directions, a covered walkway where sound did not carry well, a section of path behind the rock formations that was not visible from any of the palace windows. I walked slowly, as the body required, and I breathed the cold autumn air, and I thought. They were there within the first quarter hour. 2 young women in robes of considerably better quality than mine, attending a third who walked ahead of them with the ease of someone who owned every surface she stepped on. The second princess, I presumed. I had been right about the expensive gifts. She had the face of someone who performed warmth so often she had begun to believe it was genuine. She stopped when she saw me. The stop was fractional. A professional would have missed it. I was not a professional at missing things. "Fourth sister," she said, her voice warming into surprised pleasure with the smoothness of long practice. "You are walking today. How wonderful." She was 2 years older than Mingzhu, fully healthy, fully connected. Her mother's clan controlled significant revenue routes in the northern provinces, and she had been engaged since childhood to the son of a grand counselor. She was, in every visible way, the kind of person around whom the world arranged itself helpfully. I looked at her. For the first time in 2 years, Wei Mingzhu looked at the second princess without flinching. "Second sister," I said, "the day is cold. You should not have come out on my account." Something moved through her face, not fear. She had no reason to fear me, or had until this moment, but something adjacent to it, the specific discomfort of someone accustomed to a particular interaction who has just discovered the other person has changed the rules without telling them. "I was already walking," she said, her smile resettling. "How is your health? You look—" a pause with the shape of compassion and the substance of assessment. "You look as well as could be expected." "I am improving," I said. Another pause, this one longer. "Improving?" she repeated. "Slowly, but then I have time." I smiled at her, just slightly, the smile I had worn in dozen courts and private chambers and darkened corridors, the smile of someone who knows something they are choosing not to say yet. Then I continued my walk, moving past her at a gentle pace that the body could manage, and I did not look back. But I heard it, barely, at the edge of audibility, the sharp, low sound of her breath. Good. Let her wonder. Let them all wonder. Wei Mingzhu had spent 2 years becoming a ghost in this palace before her body was even cold. She had been quiet and declining, and expected to disappear without causing anyone any trouble. She had done everything that was asked of her, which was to say she had done nothing at all. That was over now. I had 1 year, and I had spent 11 of the years before this one making powerful people very, very uncomfortable. The lotus pond reflected the gray autumn sky. A few late blooms still floated on the surface, pale and determined. I looked at them as I walked, and I thought about the physician who came from the wrong direction, and the second princess who had breathed too sharply at the word improving, and the small room with the too small painting, and the girl who had cried herself thin in it until she believed she was meant to disappear. My name in this life was Wei Mingju, and I had decided something standing in this garden with autumn dying around me and 1 year of borrowed time in my chest like a banked coal. I was not going to disappear. Not this time. Not in any way they were expecting. That night I did not sleep. Not because the body would not allow it. It was tired enough, the simple walk through the western garden having cost it more than I expected, but because sleep in my former life had always been a calculated risk. You slept when the environment was secured, when you had mapped every exit, when you understood the full shape of the danger around you. I had not yet done any of those things. I had barely begun. So I lay still in the darkness behind the crimson bed curtains, breathing slowly, and I thought. The physician first, Shen Bo Zhao, 3 irregular visits from the wrong direction, each followed by a worsening in Mingju's condition. That was not coincidence. I had long since believed in coincidence as anything other than a failure of analysis. Someone was paying him, directing him, or both, and whoever that someone was, they had decided 2 years ago that Mingju should die quietly, on a timeline of their choosing, in a room no one important ever visited. The question was why? A princess with no clan, no allies, no cultivation ability, no political weight. What could she possibly have that was worth the careful effort of a slow poison rather than the simpler brutality of a faster method? That question had an answer. I simply did not know it yet. The second princess next, Shen Yuhua. I turned her over in my mind with the methodical patience of someone examining a mechanism for a hidden blade. The sharp breath when I said improving, the fractional stop when she first saw me walking, those were not the reactions of someone merely surprised to see a sickly girl out of bed. Those were the reactions of someone whose calculations had just been disrupted. She had been counting on something, and whatever it was, it required Mingju to continue declining on schedule. I filed that away and moved on.
The half-brother. I had not yet seen him. Xiao Hui had described him carefully. Third Prince Rong Xinghe, 22 years old, conducting visits of brief and dutiful brevity. She had said this with the particular blankness of someone who had decided not to have an opinion. I noted that. People who decided not to have opinions about powerful men were usually people who had learned that having opinions about powerful men was dangerous. He would need to be assessed in person. And then there was the thing Xiao Hui had let slip and immediately tried to unsay, that I seemed different today. That was the most important data point of all, and the most immediately dangerous. Is a servant who had known Mingju for 3 years could feel the shift in me in the space of a single afternoon. I was not hiding well enough. I had been careless, carried away by the strangeness of the situation into behaving like myself instead of like the person I was supposed to be. I would need to be more careful. I would need to understand who Mingju had been well enough to wear her convincingly, not the shell of her, not the grief-hollowed shadow Xiao Hui had described, but enough of her to pass at a distance, close enough that people who had not paid much attention to her would not notice the difference. The good news was that very few people had paid much attention to her. I lay still and breathed the sandalwood air and listened to the palace settle into the sounds of deep night, the distant footsteps of a guard rotation, the call of a night bird from somewhere in the garden, the soft scrape of tree branches against the outer wall. Even these sounds were information. The guard rotation passed my pavilion every 2/4 of an hour, slightly irregular, which meant either the captain was competent enough to vary the timing to prevent pattern recognition, or the guards themselves were inconsistent. I would know which after a few more nights. The Donghua Palace was, I was beginning to understand, a very large trap. It just depended entirely which direction you were running. By the time the first gray light began to soften the darkness beyond the window paper, I had made a list. It was not a written list. I had never written down anything I needed to survive, but it existed in my mind with the clean precision of brushwork on white silk. What I needed to know, what I needed to find, what I needed to become, and in what order. First, Mingju's body. Whatever was killing it, I needed to understand the mechanism before I could decide whether it could be reversed. The physician was poisoning her, that much I was prepared to assume provisionally, but the nature of the poison mattered enormously. Some things could be worked around, some things could not. Second, Mingju's history. Not the surface facts Xiao Hui had given me, but the texture of it. Who had been kind to her, who had been cruel, which cruelties she had absorbed without reacting, and which ones had landed somewhere deeper. I needed to know what she wanted, what she loved, what she had been before 2 years of slow erosion had taken the wanting and the loving away. Third, the Emperor. I had not yet formed a picture of him. He existed in my understanding only as an absence, the father who did not visit, the sovereign around whom all these smaller dramas orbited without ever touching. In every palace I had ever worked in, the emperor was either the source of the problem or the solution to it, and until I knew which he was in the Donghua court, I could not plan anything with real confidence. Fourth, the name. I did not know yet what name I was looking for, but I had learned, over 11 years of working in places where secrets determined survival, that there was always one name, always one thread, if you found it and pulled it carefully, that would unravel the entire knot. I rose before Xiao Hui arrived and sat at the writing table and composed a letter. It was addressed to no one in particular. It said very little of obvious importance, but embedded in the phrasing, in the specific arrangement of courtesies and the choice of which seasonal observation to include, it carried a message that would be understood by exactly one person in the world. That person was named Wen Xiaoqi. He had been my handler for the last 4 years of my former life, a slight, unremarkable man who ran a trading company that had never once turned a profit from trading. He was also, almost certainly, dead, along with the rest of the organization I had served, since I had died, and death in my line of work was rarely a solitary event. But I folded the letter carefully and put it in the sleeve of my robe anyway, because the habit of communication was a useful one to maintain, and because writing it had helped me think, and also because I was not entirely certain I was dead. The circumstances of my arrival in Mingju's body remained unclear to me. I had been on a mission, a high-value target, an inner chamber, a confrontation that went exactly as planned until the moment it did not. I remembered the blade. I remembered the cold. I did not remember dying in the way that I understand dying to feel, which is to say, I had heard from people who had nearly died that there was a quality of finality to it, a door closing. What I remembered was more like a door opening, which means either that death is simply a door and I walked through it, or that something else entirely had happened. Given that I am currently inhabiting the body of a dying princess in a dynasty that may or may not have existed in any history I had ever studied, I was prepared to entertain a wide range of explanations. What I was not prepared to do was waste time on questions I could not yet answer.
Xiao Hui arrived at the hour of the rabbit with the breakfast tray and the carefully managed expression of someone bracing for an unknown quantity. She found me already dressed, badly by court standards, since I had managed the outer robe but made a disaster of the hair, and sitting at the writing table with the composure of someone who had somewhere to be. She stopped in the doorway. "Your Highness," she said, "you dressed yourself?" "I did," I agreed. "I made something of a mess of the hair. Come and fix it."
She came and fixed it, and in the mirror I watched her face as she worked, the small, ongoing recalibration happening behind her eyes, the way she kept not quite glancing at my reflection as if checking whether what she was seeing was real. "Xiaohui," I said, when she had finished and the hair was respectable again, "I want you to tell me about the treatment. The imperial physician's treatment? Yes. What form does it take, precisely?" She set down the jade comb. "A tonic, Your Highness, taken every morning. The physician prepares it himself and sends it sealed. It tastes of—" She paused. "Bitter herbs, licorice root, other things I couldn't identify. And who receives the sealed container when it arrives? Usually I do, or the outer chamber attendant, Kui Fun. And between receiving it and bringing it to me, how long does it sit?" Another pause. This one had a different quality. The quality of someone realizing that a question they had never thought to ask had in fact been worth asking all along. "Not long," she said slowly. "Minutes, usually. Sometimes Kui Fun brings it directly. And Kui Fun, how long has she served here?" 2 years. 2 years. Exactly as long as the illness had been progressing. I did not say this out loud. Instead, I said, "I see. Bring me this morning's tonic when it arrives, but do not open the seal. Set it on this table." Xiaohui's hands were very still. "Your Highness does not intend to drink it. I intend to examine it. That is all, for now." The look she gave me in the mirror was no longer the careful blankness of a servant managing an unpredictable charge. It was something more complicated than that, something that had the shape of hope and the caution of someone who had been disappointed too many times to let hope move too quickly. "Yes, Your Highness," she said quietly. The tonic arrived at the hour of the dragon, carried by Kui Fun, a young woman of perhaps 16 with a pleasant face and the particular quality of friendliness that was slightly too consistent, slightly too ready. I had known many people like that. They were either genuinely warm or professionally warm, and the difference only revealed itself under pressure. I thanked her pleasantly and waited until she was gone before picking up the sealed container and holding it to the light from the window. The seal was standard imperial physician issue. The container was ceramic, white, small enough to fit in one palm. I opened it carefully, preserving the seal, and brought it close enough to smell. Bitter herbs, licorice root, and underneath both, something else, something that had no business being in a medicinal tonic. A faint, almost sweet undertone, the kind that registered as pleasant to the uninformed nose and as a warning to anyone who spent time studying the pharmacology of substances designed to end lives slowly and without obvious trace. I had spent considerable time studying exactly that. White heron root, ground fine enough that it dissolved completely in liquid, tasteless in sufficient dilution. In small, consistent doses over a period of months or years, it produced a progressive wasting of the body's vital functions, first fatigue, then loss of appetite, then the weakening of the breath, until the patient simply faded, as if the life in them had simply run out. It mimicked constitutional weakness so perfectly that even a skilled physician examining the body after death would find nothing definitive to name. It was, in the language of my former profession, an elegant method, patient, invisible, expensive in its invisibility. Someone had been paying for elegance. I set the tonic container on the table and sat with my hands folded and thought about the second princess and her sharp breath, and the physician who came from the wrong corridor, and the attendant Kui Fun who had arrived precisely when the illness began. Then I thought about what it meant that someone had gone to this much careful expense to remove a girl who, by every visible measure, had nothing worth taking. Xiaohui arrived at the hour of the rabbit with the breakfast tray and the carefully managed expression of someone bracing for an unknown quantity. She found me already dressed. Badly, by court standards, since I had managed the outer robe but made a disaster of the hair, and sitting at the writing table with the composure of someone who had somewhere to be. She stopped in the doorway. "Your Highness," she said, "you dressed yourself?" "I did," I agreed. "I made something of a mess of the hair. Come and fix it." She came and fixed it, and in the mirror I watched her face as she worked, the small, ongoing recalibration happening behind her eyes, the way she kept not quite glancing at my reflection as if checking whether what she was seeing was real. "Xiao Hui," I said, when she had finished and the hair was respectable again, "I want you to tell me about the treatment. The imperial physician's treatment? Yes. What form does it take, precisely?" She set down the jade comb. "A tonic, Your Highness, taken every morning. The physician prepares it himself and sends it sealed. It tastes of—" She paused. "Bitter herbs, licorice root, other things I couldn't identify. And who receives the sealed container when it arrives? Usually I do, or the outer chamber attendant, Kui Fun. And between receiving it and bringing it to me, how long does it sit?" Another pause. This one had a different quality, the quality of someone realizing that a question they had never thought to ask had in fact been worth asking all along. "Not long," she said slowly. "Minutes, usually. Sometimes Kui Fun brings it directly. And Kui Fun, how long has she served here?" 2 years. 2 years. Exactly as long as the illness had been progressing. I did not say this out loud. Instead, I said, "I see. Bring me this morning's tonic when it arrives, but do not open the seal. Set it on this table." Xiao Hui's hands were very still. "Your Highness does not intend to drink it. I intend to examine it. That is all, for now." The look she gave me in the mirror was no longer the careful blankness of a servant managing an unpredictable charge. It was something more complicated than that, something that had the shape of hope and the caution of someone who had been disappointed too many times to let hope move too quickly. "Yes, Your Highness," she said quietly. The tonic arrived at the hour of the dragon, carried by Kui Fun, a young woman of perhaps 16 with a pleasant face and the particular quality of friendliness that was slightly too consistent, slightly too ready. I had known many people like that. They were either genuinely warm or professionally warm, and the difference only revealed itself under pressure. I thanked her pleasantly and waited until she was gone before picking up the sealed container and holding it to the light from the window. The seal was standard imperial physician issue. The container was ceramic, white, small enough to fit in one palm. I opened it carefully, preserving the seal, and brought it close enough to smell. Bitter herbs, licorice root, and underneath both, something else, something that had no business being in a medicinal tonic. A faint, almost sweet undertone, the kind that registered as pleasant to the uninformed nose and as a warning to anyone who spent time studying the pharmacology of substances designed to end lives slowly and without obvious trace. I had spent considerable time studying exactly that. White heron root, ground fine enough that it dissolved completely in liquid, tasteless in sufficient dilution. In small, consistent doses over a period of months or years, it produced a progressive wasting of the body's vital functions, first fatigue, then loss of appetite, then the weakening of the breath, until the patient simply faded, as if the life in them had simply run out. It mimicked constitutional weakness so perfectly that even a skilled physician examining the body after death would find nothing definitive to name. It was, in the language of my former profession, an elegant method, patient, invisible, expensive in its invisibility. Someone had been paying for elegance. I set the tonic container on the table and sat with my hands folded and thought about the second princess and her sharp breath, and the physician who came from the wrong corridor, and the attendant Kui Fun who had arrived precisely when the illness began.
Then I thought about what it meant that someone had gone to this much careful expense to remove a girl who, by every visible measure, had nothing worth taking.
There was something I did not know. Something about Mingju herself, about her blood, her birth, her position, that made her dangerous to someone. Not as an enemy, not as a rival in any obvious sense, but as an existence. Simply by existing, she threatened something. I needed to know what. I poured the tonic into the potted plant near the window, a small, determined osmanthus that had been flowering stubbornly in the corner of the room despite everything, and refilled the container from the small pot of plain, warm water Xiaohui kept on the brazier. I resealed it with careful pressure and set it back in its position on the table. Then I sat down and ate breakfast, which was the first meal I had eaten since arriving in this body, and which I therefore ate with the focused attention of someone restocking provisions before a long campaign. Xiao Hui watched me eat 3 full bowls of congee with the expression of someone watching a miracle occur. "Your Highness's appetite," she began, "is improved. Yes, I find I am very hungry today." I was going to need the body to work. That meant feeding it, resting it adequately, and where possible, beginning to rebuild what 2 years of slow poisoning had taken. I had worked in damaged bodies before, broken ribs, a cracked collarbone, that one winter when a mission had required operating on 3 days without sleep, and the principle was always the same. You assessed what you had, you worked within its limits, and you pushed those limits incrementally until they expanded. White heron root damage was slow to reverse, but without the ongoing dose, the body would begin to stabilize. In 2 weeks, possibly 3, I might have enough strength to do more than walk the garden without exhausting myself. 1 year, the physician had said. He had based that estimate on a patient who was continuing to receive poison. I was no longer that patient. It was 3 days later that I first saw the third prince. He came without announcement, which was apparently his custom, or rather the custom of someone who had learned that the person he was visiting would not send anyone who arrived, and therefore dispensed with the courtesy of warning. He arrived in the late afternoon when the light through the window paper had gone amber and long, and he brought with him 2 attendants who waited outside and a face that I spent the first several seconds reading with as much attention as I had ever given any face in my professional life. Rong Shenghe was 22 and looked it in the way that people who have spent their youth in difficult circumstances look their age. Not old exactly, but aware. He had the lean build of someone who practiced martial arts not as decoration but as habit, and the eyes of someone who had learned to make his thoughts difficult to see. He was not, I noted, the kind of handsome that required effort. It was simply there, and he seemed to regard it with the indifference of someone who had found it more liability than asset. He stopped when he saw me sitting at the writing table. I was copying text, a piece of classical poetry Xiao Hui had found for me, a task I had chosen specifically because it required focus, while leaving my peripheral attention free. I set down the brush without haste and turned to face him. "Third brother," I said. I had practiced the form of address, the degree of deference appropriate to their relative positions. "I did not expect you." Something shifted in his face, very small, the specific quality of adjustment that happens when a person walks into a room expecting one thing and finds another. "Third sister," he said. His voice was measured, careful in a different way from Shen Yuhua's careful. She had been performing warmth, and performance was familiar to me. This was something else. This was the careful of someone choosing their words not to manage an impression, but because he genuinely did not know what he was dealing with. "You are at the writing table," he said, slowly. "I am," I agreed. "You have not been at the writing table," he said, "in some months." "I have not," I agreed, "but I find I have grown tired of lying down." He looked at me for a long moment. I looked back with the pleasant, unreadable expression I had been practicing in the bronze mirror each morning, the one that sat on Mingju's face without demanding anything. "You look different," he said. "I feel different," which was entirely true. He crossed the room and sat in the chair across the writing table, which was not where visitors sat. Visitors sat on the reception bench near the door. He sat across from me as if we were about to have a conversation rather than an exchange. Courtesies. And he rested his forearms on the table and looked at me with those difficult-to-read eyes and said, "The physician told me your condition was unchanged." "Physicians," I said pleasantly, "are sometimes wrong." Another small shift. He glanced at the osmanthus plant near the window, which was, I noticed, looking slightly more vigorous than it had 3 days ago, because I had been watering it carefully and talking to it each morning, which was a habit left over from a former life in which small green things had been a reliable source of calm, and then looked back at me. "Fourth sister," he said, "what is happening?" It was not quite a question. The inflection was wrong for a question. It had the weight of someone naming a thing they suspected was true rather than asking whether it might be. I looked at him. In 11 years, I had assessed a great many people in a short time. The category I had learned to pay most attention to was the category of people who were hiding something they were ashamed of rather than something they intended to use. Guilt had a particular texture. It sat differently on a face than calculation. Rong Xinghe was hiding something, and whatever it was, it sat on him like a stone he had been carrying for a long time. "I decided," I said carefully, "to stop being willing to disappear." The stone shifted, just slightly. His jaw tightened once and released. "That is," he said, and then stopped. "Inadvisable?" I offered. "I was going to say that it is overdue." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bird called from the garden, the same night bird I had been hearing since my first evening, though it was not yet evening, and I wondered if it was distressed about something or simply had opinions about the hour. "There is something I should have told you," Rong Xinghe said, "a long time ago, before the illness began." "Then tell me now," I said. He looked at me with those careful eyes, and I had the sense of a person arriving at a decision they had been circling for a long time. "Not here," he said. "The walls in this pavilion are not—" He stopped, glanced briefly at the door, then at the window, the assessment of someone who had also, at some point, learned to map a room. "Not here. Can you walk to the autumn pavilion tomorrow at the hour of the snake?" The autumn pavilion. I had noted it on my walk through the western garden, the pavilion near the lotus pond with sightlines in 3 directions, the covered walkway where sound did not carry. I had chosen that location in my mental cataloging of the garden as the best place to have a conversation one did not want overheard. He had chosen it too. That told me something. I was not certain yet what it told me, but it was data, and data was the foundation of everything. "I can walk there," I said. He rose, and the attendants outside must have heard or sensed something, because one of them shifted beyond the door. He straightened his robes with the unconscious habit of someone restoring a public face after briefly removing it, and his voice shifted back to the correct register of a formal visit. "I am glad to find fourth sister's health improved," he said. "I will inform the household." "Third brother is kind," I said. He was halfway to the door when he stopped, without turning. His back was very straight. "The osmanthus is flowering," he said quietly. "It was not flowering last month." Then he left. I sat at the writing table for a long time after his footsteps faded. Xiao Hui came in eventually to trim the lamp,
and she found me sitting still with my hands folded and my eyes on the osmanthus plant, which was indeed flowering, small pale gold blooms that smelled of autumn and cold coming. "Your Highness," she said softly, "Xiaohui, tell me about the third prince. Tell me everything, and this time do not decide in advance which parts are worth mentioning." She set down the lamp-trimming tools, sat in the chair Rong Xinghe had used, which I noted she had never done before, and she told me. She told me about the year that Rong Xinghe had spent at the Northern Warder, age 18, during a conflict that the court records described as a minor territorial dispute, and that anyone
who had been there described in other terms entirely. She told me about the frostbite scar on his left hand, visible if you knew to look. She told me about the way he had come to visit Mingzhu not 3 times in 2 years, as his official record showed, but 6, 3 of those visits unofficial, arriving alone without attendants, staying only long enough to sit in the outer reception room and look at the closed door of her chamber. He had never asked to see her on those visits. He had simply come and sat and left. "He came and sat in the reception room," I said, "without asking to come in." "Yes, Your Highness." "And Mingzhu, the previous, did she know about those visits?" Xiaohui's expression moved through something careful. "I told her, once. She asked me not to tell her again." I sat with that for a moment. A girl who was dying, asking not to be told that someone was sitting outside her door. The grief in that, the specific, exhausted grief of someone who had stopped being able to hold any more wanting, was something I understood, not from my own life, but from every face I had ever seen on someone who had given up on a thing they had once loved. Mingzhu had loved someone, or begun to, and she had cut it off herself out of the mercy of not burdening anyone with her dying. I thought about the osmanthus flowering. I thought about a 22-year-old man who had learned to map rooms and kept coming back to sit outside a door he never asked to open. And I thought whatever he knows, he has been carrying it alone, and whatever he came to tell me tomorrow in the autumn pavilion, he had been trying to tell Mingzhu for months, maybe years. She had not let him. I was not Mingzhu. But I was in Mingzhu's body, in Mingzhu's life, with Mingzhu's one remaining year, and the girl who had owned this life before me deserved better than what she got: a slow poison, a too small painting, a room facing the wall, and a door she kept closed because she thought it was kinder. I was going to find out what had been done to her. I was going to find out who ordered the physician from the wrong corridor and placed the attendant Chuifen at precisely the right moment. I was going to find the name hidden in the thing Rong Xinghe knew and had been carrying alone. And then I was going to take this palace apart, quietly, methodically, and with the specific competence of someone who had spent 11 years being very good at making powerful people regret their decisions. The osmanthus bloomed in its corner, pale gold, patient. Outside, the night bird called again, and this time I thought perhaps it was not distress at all. Perhaps it was simply announcing itself. Perhaps it was simply saying, "I am here. I am still here." I understood the feeling. Tomorrow then, the autumn pavilion, the hour of the snake. I blew out the lamp and lay down in the dark, and for the first time since waking in this life, I slept. The autumn pavilion at the hour of the snake was cold and smelled of frost and dried lotus stems, the pond beyond it reflecting a sky the color of old pewter. I arrived before him, which was intentional. I had catalogued 3 entry points and 2 positions from which a conversation could be overheard if someone were determined enough to try, and I wanted to be certain none of them were occupied. They were not. I stood at the railing and watched the dead lotus heads bend in the wind and waited. He came alone, no attendants, which confirmed that this was not an official visit. He was wearing plain scholar's robes, dark blue, which in the context of the palace was its own kind of disguise, dressed to be overlooked, dressed to be a shape rather than a person. He was good at it.
I had almost not tracked him on his approach until he was 20 paces away, which for someone of my background was a notable achievement on his part. He stood beside me at the railing. He did not look at me directly. "I will tell you something that I cannot unsay once I have said it." "Then say it. Unsaying things is generally less useful than people believe." He was quiet for a moment. The wind moved through the dead lotus stems. "Our mother," he said, "was not who the court records say she was." I turned to look at him. His jaw was set. He was looking at the pond, at the pewter sky reflected in it.
"The imperial noble consort Wei," he said, "was recorded as the daughter of a minor Wei clan official from the eastern provinces. She was not. Her family name was not Wei. She took that name when she entered the palace because the name she was born with would have made her entry impossible." He paused. "Her birth name was wrong." The word landed in the cold air and stayed there. Wrong. The imperial surname. I kept my expression still. Outside, nothing changed. Inside, every calculation I had made in the past 3 days quietly rearranged itself around this new fact, like river water rerouting around a stone. "She was the emperor's cousin," Rong Xinghe said. "The daughter of a prince who was killed in the succession war before I was born. The records of his children were destroyed. His daughter was hidden and given a new name and placed in service. She eventually attracted the attention of the emperor, but no one, not even he, knew who she truly was." He stopped. His hands on the railing were very still. "No one except one person who found out and who has kept that knowledge as a weapon for 20 years. And if it were known," I said slowly, "that the imperial noble consort Rong, as she truly was, had a daughter, that daughter," he said, "would have a blood claim to the imperial line that rivals the claim of every prince currently positioned for succession." He finally turned to look at me. His eyes were very direct. "Including the claims of the people who have spent 20 years ensuring that daughter stayed small and ignorant and died before she could learn her own name." The wind moved through the lotus stems. I looked at Rong Xinghe, the third prince, my half-brother in this life, the one who had come to sit outside a closed door 6 times, and I understood now the stone he had been carrying. He had known what Mingju was and what it meant, and he had watched her fade toward death in a room facing the wall, poisoned by someone who needed me gone before I became inconvenient. And I had 1 year. No, I corrected myself. I had stopped the poison 3 days ago. I had, in all likelihood, considerably more than 1 year, provided I was careful. Provided also that the people who had invested 20 years in my erasure did not notice I had stopped cooperating with it. "Third brother," I said. "Yes." "The person who led you to that document," I said, "do you have any suspicion of who it might have been?" He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that I had begun to think he would not answer. "There is a man, a scholar nominally. He serves in the archive. He has been kind to me in a way I have never been able to fully account for. Not obviously, not in a way I could point to, but consistently, over years. His name is Wen Bochen." He paused. "He is unremarkable in every external regard, except that when I found the sealed case, his seal was on the lock. Wen Bochen. The family name hit me like a blade I had not seen coming. Wen. My handler's family name had been Wen Shaoqi, the unremarkable man with the unprofitable trading company.
The world was full of people named Wen. It was not an uncommon name. There was no reason to assume connection. There was every reason to assume coincidence, which I did not believe in. I kept my face entirely still. "I see," I said. "Do you know him?" Rong Xinghe said. He was watching me now with those careful eyes. I would like to meet him, I said. Arrange it if you can, quietly. He studied me for another long moment. You are, he said slowly, not who you were a week ago. I met his eyes. No, I said, honestly, I am not. He accepted this without pushing it further, which told me something about him, too, that he was a man who understood the value of leaving certain questions unasked, who had learned that some truths arrived in their own time, and that pressing them only made them retreat. We stood at the railing of the autumn pavilion for a while longer, side by side, looking at the pewter sky and the patient water, and the dead lotus heads that had survived the autumn, and would survive the winter, and would, when the time came, bloom again. I should have come sooner, he said, finally, quietly, not to me exactly, to the pond, to the sky, to the girl who had sat behind a closed door and not let him in. I thought about Mingju, about the face in the mirror that had clearly cried often, about the door she had kept closed out of the mercy of not burdening anyone with her dying. You are here now, that is what matters. He nodded once, a small, tight movement, and then he was the third prince again, composed, formal, dressed to be overlooked. He straightened his robes. I will arrange the meeting. A week, perhaps. I need to be careful. Be careful, I agreed, but not too slow. He left the way he had come, quiet as a shadow through the gray afternoon. I stayed at the railing until his footsteps had fully faded, and then a little longer, watching the frost settle on the wooden boards around me in tiny, precise crystals. Rong Ming-ju, a name I had not known I was wearing, a blood claim that someone had spent 20 years and a slow poison to erase, and a scholar in the Imperial Archive named Wen Buchen, with a seal on a lock, who had been quietly, consistently kind to the third prince for years. I thought about the letter I had folded and put in my sleeve on the first morning, the letter written to no one, in the code of a dead organization, addressed to a handler who was almost certainly gone. I thought about the possibility that he was not. The frost finished settling, the dead lotus heads went still as the wind dropped, and the pond surface smoothed to a perfect mirror, reflecting the gray sky back at itself, exact and cold and clear. I pushed away from the railing and began the slow walk back to my room, marshalling the body's limited energy with the patience I was learning to apply to everything about this life. I had a week before the meeting with Wen Buchen, a week to continue rebuilding the body, to learn more of the palace's patterns, to decide how much to trust the third prince, in what ways and for what purpose. I had one name now, a real one, and a reason, finally, clearly, fully, to stay alive. In my former life, that was generally considered enough to begin.